Hi, welcome to Chinese Medicine Dietetics. Today we'll be discussing the spleen and stomach qi deficiency. So the patient's case study today was a 28-year-old female who was a retail worker and had a predominantly vegan vegetarian diet with a focus on raw foods. She did express that she had warm and cooked foods occasionally, and upon further investigation, occasionally meant sometimes throughout the winter or when it was sometimes cold. The main complaint of this patient was persistent abdominal bloating, which was worse for eating. So every time this patient ate, she became noticeably bloated, probably explaining it as becoming 2 times more distended than usual at best. And that the only thing that made this better was actually not eating or actually significantly reducing the amount of foods that she ate. So the other general signs and symptoms accompanying this complaint was general fatigue throughout the day, particularly in the morning, but would last throughout the day. She had quite a pale complexion overall. She was always feeling full, distended and bloated in the tummy. She had very little appetite because of this feeling. She mentioned that she had loose stools on more regularly than anything else, and that she woke up with puffy eyes, and that they were considerably puffy upon waking, and that this didn't actually go down until around midday. She expressed that this was kind of the equivalent of the bloating in her tummy, in the sense that it was quite embarrassing for her when this happened, which of late had become every day. The onset of this is reported to have started around 6 to 12 months ago. However, it could have been earlier than that, and it was just not severe enough for her to truly feel the need to register it in her mind. She has a medical history of bulimia. So she was bulimic for 6 months at the age of 16. And since then has always had regular eating patterns, and she can go really long hours without eating. Obviously, retail kind of demands that of you in some cases, but I think this patient naturally would do so anyway. When we talked about the bulimia and whether or not that had been truly addressed, she did confide that she had been in counselling for this regularly at the time, and that is how she got out of that particular behavioural pattern and psychological pattern. However, I do suspect that there is an ongoing eating disorder profile there. There's a lot of issues with eating, feeling comfortable eating. There seemed to be quite a lot of concern about putting on weight, even though she's quite a small frame. So the patient's menarche arrived at 11 years of age, and since then she's actually experienced quite irregular periods, and usually it will go between 28 to 32 day cycles, sometimes 21 day cycles. It'll continually jump. And she reports having pain on the first day, but it's not so bad that it's debilitating for her. And her menses is quite scanty. So by day 3, she'll be at the end of her cycle. Her tongue was pale, slightly swollen and scalloped with a thin white coat. And her pulse overall was quite weak. But it was especially deficient and deep and weak in the right middle position. So the Chinese medicine disease name, I suspect, is abdominal bloating. That is the main complaint. And the Chinese medicine diagnosis that I came to conclusion was spleen and stomach qi deficiency with underlying dampness. So the bloating is caused by a weak spleen and stomach qi. The spleen qi should be going up and the stomach qi should be going down. But when the stomach qi and the spleen qi are both weak, or either one of them is weak, then the qi dynamic isn't working as it should, and the qi then isn't dispersing in the directions that it should. So it becomes congested in the middle burner. And that's when we see abdominal bloating. So this also causes an obstruction in the fluid metabolism of the body, and it causes the fluids to accumulate, resulting in the dampness, which pathogenically it collects in the tissues of the abdomen with this kind of pattern. But also we know that spleen qi deficiency with damp, we do tend to see that the puffiness of the eyes. So I believe that this is the diagnosis, and this is what I worked on accordingly for food advice and nutritional therapy for this patient. So what's the role of dietetic therapy in a patient treatment? Well, actually it turns out it's more important than what we would primarily think in the beginning of our studies, or if we didn't do Chinese medicine. It's actually, in a Chinese medicine perspective, food is a vital proponent of medicine and healing, and it is prescribed accordingly. So the physician Bian Quirk is quoted to have said that the primary measure of a practitioner, after having accurately diagnosed the disease, is to prescribe the correct diet for the patient. So this was said about circa 200 BC. And this mentality and culture really is quite prominent and evident in Chinese medicine and Chinese medicine dietetics, as well as Chinese medicine herbal theory. In Chinese medicine dietetics, a practitioner gradually makes changes to a patient's diet so that it becomes more suitable to their constitution, and also so that it addresses the pathology of their diagnosis. And we say gradually because we don't want to scare a patient away from making these changes. And psychologically, it can be really overwhelming to ask patients to completely detach from habits that they've had a lifetime of forming, or have particular tendencies and addictions and cravings towards. Particularly Chinese medicine dietetic theory places, and has always placed, regardless of the diagnosis, an emphasis on strengthening the stomach and spleen. And that is because they are the foundation of making qi. Now we know that lungs also are responsible for making qi, but in terms of really making and generating qi, the spleen and stomach are vital components, and qi is vital for metabolism, it's vital for repair, it's vital for immunity, and it's vital for reproduction. So it covers a whole bunch of bases for health that usually patients come to us with. And it also is, we can say, the building block foundation of just having a healthy person in front of us. Practitioners match different foods according to their nature, and they reconcile the tastes of these foods with the seasons and the person's constitution and disease presentation. So the inner canon of the Yellow Emperor discusses the importance of the 5 tastes, and they are sour, bitter, sweet, pungent, and salty. And all of these have different therapeutic effects on the body and particular organs. And so the Yellow Emperor explains that harmony of the 5 tastes within a meal is vital for the preservation of health. So in essence, it was from the very, very ancient times taught to Chinese medicine practitioners that to have a healthy person in front of you and to lead a healthy life, you needed to have a balanced nutritional input. And that balanced nutrition required the consideration of these 5 tastes, and it also discussed that any single ingredient may have 1 of 4 properties, and that the 4 properties would be, it would either be lifting, would either be floating, it'd either be lowering, or it would be sinking. So Chinese medicine really, it takes into account the 5 tastes, how they affect the organ pathology or balancing of the organs, as well as how those particular ingredients and overall meal cause the energy to be directed through the body. So whether we want it to come, we want to sink something down, bring like facial edema down, or heat down from the top of the body down to the lower parts of the body. This is all incorporated in Chinese medicine. Chinese medicine also takes into account the thermal energetics of food. So foods can either be cold, slightly cool, neutral, warming, or hot. And it will be taken into account based on how the person presents. If they've got hot symptoms or symptoms of fire blazing, then we will consider cool or cold foods. If that patient has cold symptoms, then we're considering warming to hot foods, and so on. So by considering these various qualities in prescribing a diet, Chinese medicine dietetics not only supplies a balanced nutrition, but it offers a diet that contains a therapeutic effect similar to Chinese herbal medicine, and actually complementary too. So the general principles of and recommendations for this patient was to eat only cooked and warm foods for a particular extended amount of time. This was to support the qi mechanism in her body. So we discussed cooking methods of slow and long cooking methods, such as soups, broths, stews, porridge. These are all easy digest, which means the spleen and stomach have less work to do to absorb those nutrients and manufacture qi. It also means that it has to do less work overall, and that means it will probably reduce the bloating. We discussed eating at regular intervals throughout the day. She wasn't showing signs of having been hyperglycemic, so we discussed having meals every 3 to 4 hours, which would be doable, and having the last meal, dinner, between 6 to 7 p.m. in the evening. I did explain that it's okay if you have social occasions, you can make exceptions. Ideally, we want you to have your meal by 2 hours before going to bed at night, and that by eating regularly at those 3 to 4 hour intervals, we're actually supporting the stomach and spleen in constantly keeping that digestive fire alive. We discussed having those smaller meals so that it didn't feel so gluttonous, and that simple food combinations with a few ingredients were ideal, so that the spleen and stomach didn't have too much to process every time. And that ideally her diet at the moment would feature high complex carbohydrates and high vegetable content with a lower animal protein content, just to again support the easy digestion for the spleen and stomach, really get that digestive fire burning without having to do too much. We discussed the beneficial foods, and so I didn't break it down too strictly into the 5 tastes, the 4 properties, and the thermal energetics. I didn't want to overwhelm her, but I did give her a general overall picture. So I said neutral to warm and sweet flavors were ideal for her, and that light grains, oats, roasted barley, sweet rice, white rice, congee, they are all under that category, and they're very complementary to the spleen and stomach. Also complementary to the spleen and stomach is sweet potato, celeriac, squash, corn, carrot, parsnip, black beans, chickpeas, peas, yams, kumara, walnuts, stewed fruit instead of raw fruit. And then also I added meats in there, though she said she was vegan vegetarian. Upon exploring whether she'd be happy to perhaps include some meat, animal proteins in her diet, she was open to that. So I included those for her, but I don't expect her to incorporate those straight away. I'd be actually really surprised if she did. We also discussed some acrid flavors that were okay for her in small portions at this time. So she could use onions and leek and garlic and turnip and pepper, fresh ginger, cinnamon, nutmeg and fennel, but just not in too many quantities. And I listed some complex sweet flavors as sweeteners for her, if she really decided she needed a sweetener in any of her meals, that these would be the best to support her condition at this time. So molasses, dates, rice syrup, barley malt, palm sugar. All of those ingredients are really easy and accessible to find in any supermarket, any local store. And that's why I kept it that simple. And we don't want to make it too complicated for anyone to follow certain dietary advice. I also mentioned that it's ideal for her at this point to avoid cold and raw foods and avoid all the foods listed in this list, because it isn't going to work in favor of lighting the digestive fire and supporting the spleen and stomach to rebuild their strength and qi to be able to do a good job of digesting and diminishing the bloating symptoms. And we also discussed foods that generate dampness and tend to congest, because there is an element of dampness in this patient's presentation. She's got the swelling of the eyes in the mornings, and the puffiness doesn't reduce until midday. And we know that when a spleen and stomach qi are deficient, it is a condition that leads to damp in the long term. So we discussed cutting down on ice cream and dairy products. We said, you know, it's okay to have them occasionally in very small portions, but to be mindful also that sugar and chocolates and nuts and seeds also are dampness generating, and just to be mindful of how much we consume. She was really surprised about that. And I think that's really good. It means that it'll bring to her attention and it'll bring mindfulness to her eating. So the original recipe I suggested is one that I've created for myself not so long ago for the same condition. So it's a simple millet, fig and ginger porridge. Millet is a salty sweet grain which is slightly cold. It enters the spleen and stomach channel and kidney channels. It drains damp, and it's indicated for poor appetite, fatigue, loose stools, indigestion, especially if caused by spleen qi deficiency. So I thought, great, we'll add that in. I added fresh ginger zest to this recipe because it's warming, right? And millet is slightly cooling. So I thought we'd balance that out. Fresh ginger enters the lung, the spleen and the stomach channels, and it also warms the middle burner. And it's particularly great for stomach qi deficiency. And finally, I thought something sweet in the morning is really nice sometimes to balance out this weird millet ginger combination. So I added fresh fig, and I chose fig because it's neutral and sweet. So it's great for the earth element. It enters the spleen, stomach and the lung and the large intestine channels. And it benefits the spleen and harmonizes the stomach. And it's indicated for loose stools and indigestion and poor appetite, especially if caused by spleen qi deficiency. So I thought, perfect, we'll add that one in. This recipe is actually really easy to prepare. It's 120 grams of millet with 2 liters of water and 1 tablespoon of fresh ginger. The ginger you can add or reduce as per your taste. The preparation time is 5 minutes and the cooking time is 30 minutes. And it actually makes up to 4 to 6 servings. So we can cook this at the beginning of the week and it will last a few mornings and it won't take much time. So it's actually quite practical and it's quite delicious, and it gets the digestive fire going in the morning. So we rinse the millet under cold water a few times, and then we add the 2 liters of water into a medium-sized pot, and we bring that water to the boil. And then we, once the water's boiling, we add the millet, and basically the boiling will stop because the millet's cooling and it takes time for the water to come back to a boil. But once the water's back to the boil, we want to turn that heat on low and we want to continue cooking for another 20 to 30 minutes. So we stir the millet intermittently to ensure that it doesn't stick to the bottom of the pot. But if you like a thicker consistency, you can keep the millet on the pot for longer. Just make sure that you continue to stir, because sometimes you can get it stuck to the bottom and that's really annoying to clean afterwards. But basically, if you like it runny or you don't want it too thick, once the millet is tender, the porridge is ready. What I did forget to mention is that you add the ginger while it's cooking, just to keep it. So you add once it's to the second boil, you add ginger. So I should amend the recipe for that. And you serve it up with fresh figs. And I did discuss with this patient that if she wanted a sweetener, she could use the molasses that we discussed earlier. This is the patient handout that I prepared for the patient. Where there was enough space, I tried to explain why. I tried to give little hints as to why we made certain suggestions, because sometimes we walk away and we forget and we go, why is that important? So anyway, those are my recommendations for this patient with spleen and stomach chi deficiency. I hope that you enjoyed. I know myself, I'm really looking forward to incorporating more of this into my time in clinic. Thank you.